Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion, a time of the week where 6 or 7 of us come together to study the Word of God, and then we invite whoever would like to join us to do so in the chat room. You know, and gentlemen, I really look forward to this time each week. We don't always come to certain conclusions, but at least we study the Word of God, and we may scratch our heads over a few things, and we may see things a little bit differently on a few points, but it's all about studying His Word and striving to factor it into our daily lives. Looks like everyone is doing well today. We are absent Wayne. He's away in a gospel meeting somewhere in the world where they don't have internet, or he doesn't have the time, which is probably more like it, and we can all relate to that. Anything special going on in the world that we need to talk about from any of our respective locations?
Might want to mention to some of our listeners that may have known him, I just got it on my mind that Brother Harry Pickup Jr., which he was 91, he was certainly old enough he could have dropped the junior, but Harry Pickup Jr. of Tampa, Florida, passed away about 4:43 this morning. I very much admired that man's dedication to the truth, and he, through the years, has helped me a great deal.
Yeah.
He's helped a lot of us, he really has.
He was 91, you say?
Yes, sir.
And we had mentioned also, I think, that his son Marty had passed away
a couple of years ago.
2014, I think.
I believe that's right.
Yeah. His wife, Joella Pickup, gave me voice lessons when I was my 1 year down there at Florida College. So, sweet lady. She's passed on as well.
Yeah.
Okay. In the chat room, if one of y'all would drop in there, just remind everybody to refresh the page if they haven't done it yet, so that the video will refresh to the current live event.
If they open the page prior to about 10 minutes before we started, it won't work. So
okay.
They'll have to refresh.
Okay, very good, very good. And it looks like they're doing that now. So
we need a time of refreshing.
Their time of refreshing will come. All right. Well, last week we left off in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, there in verse 12. And you know, I was looking ahead a little bit, and we thought Paul was kind of rough on the Corinthians in his first letter that we have, but he really seems to unload on them a little bit with a measure of sarcasm. Kind of suggesting the great question, why did you ever doubt me, you might say. So let's go ahead and pick up in our reading here with verse 12. And let's see, Paul, if you would, let me bring that up on the screen. I forgot to bring my other Bible program up, so we'll do that. If you would read, looks like verses 12 through 15, Paul.
I'd be happy to do that. Let me lock in. Are you going to share that, John?
And there we go.
Okay. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning at verse 12 down through, did you say 15?
Yes.
Okay. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works.
All right, thank you, Paul. All right, last week we had concluded our study. We had made it down to verse 11 there. And Paul talked about his work within the kingdom. He talked about not taking support from the church in Corinth, but robbing other churches instead. And he asked the question in verse 11, and why? Because I do not love you? He says, God knows I do. And so it is that he picks up with in verse 12, and what I am doing, I will continue to do. And this is the English Standard Version, in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. It makes me wonder if maybe some of the accusations that were brought against Paul were brought by people claiming to maybe teach with the same authority as Paul. Not the other apostles, but those claiming at least said authority. Any thoughts?
Well, if they're not specifically claiming the authority, we know that there are people who are taking that authority. And I always think of Diotrephes as being somebody who would go so far as to ban somebody else from coming to the congregation to speak. So whether they're deliberately saying they're an apostle or they're just taking the authority of apostles, we see that very action today by people taking the authority that was only given to apostles, that is to speak for Christ and create doctrine.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and
go ahead, Tom.
yeah, and I was also going to say, you look at that verse, you see the idea that Paul is not going to back down and quit doing and saying what is right just because he's criticized for it. That's I think there's a key element for us to consider in that, as we live and preach.
Paul says back in verse 7 that in looking at that he preached the gospel to them without charge. And I think maybe it's kind of going back and picking up on some of those kinds of themes, that what I'm doing, I've been preaching the gospel, no charge to you. I love you. That's why I'm doing this. God knows of my love for you. And so what I'm doing, I'm going to keep on doing. I'm going to keep on preaching. And then he contrasts that in the next verse, verse 13, with those who are false apostles, those who are deceitful workers, those who are wolves in sheep's clothing, so to speak, and there seems to be that contrast there.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
It's always surprising to me. I mean, in some ways, it's a little discouraging to think about how quickly, second, third, fourth centuries, various false doctrines, caused huge havoc, and yet here in the life of Paul and writing of one of his earlier letters, there's already people who are false apostles, and he's even Paul is surprised in his letter to the churches in Galatia how quickly things went off track there, and somebody came along after him preaching something different, and so almost from the very get-go. And we could be sort of puzzled about that, but he gives us the reason here. It was the activity of Satan who is trying to work against God's plan for his kingdom.
But look today, though. If people were back then as they are today, then what happened made perfect sense. It wasn't God. It wasn't the will of God that the apostasy would happen. Obviously, okay. But you've got some people who want to jump on the bandwagon of the latest, greatest thing. Think about movies. You let one great movie come out, and by the next summer, they've got 3 or 4 copycats and everything.
Right.
Same with books and things like that. And my theory is that you had a lot of Judaizing teachers who saw this new way coming and realized that there wasn't any place for them in it, and became a part of the way, but brought in their narcissistic desire for leadership and to have people following them as they once did. It's not too surprising. It's sad. It's terribly sad. But it's not too surprising that there would be people thinking that they could do this better than Paul, and Paul's not all that great, and I know Scripture, and I can do the same thing as Paul, and he's making money at it, and I can make money at it.
Well, John, you kind of bring a interesting point. What might be the motivation? I look at this passage a lot of times, and I've used it to point out to say that perhaps a lot of times ministers of Satan don't appreciate that they're ministers of Satan.
Yeah. And I would also add to that, don't forget that we're dealing with a group of brethren, some of them influential, who wanted to follow Christ but did not want to give up their former faith, which would have been Judaism.
Yeah. And maybe even some idolatry too.
Yeah. I haven't even thought about it from the standpoint of the Gentiles not wanting to give up idolatry. I mean, we always seem to plug it into the Jews, and like the Jewish apostates, those that, like I said, they wanted to accept Jesus. Just like today. Today there is a sect of Judaism called Messianic Jews, and typically they accept Jesus Christ as the rejected Messiah. Of course, they're also looking for him to come back and establish the throne of David on earth, premillennialism and so on. But they want to hold on to both. they want to hold on to both the old law and profess to follow Christ. And of course they're going to go after Paul, because Paul says, the old law's been nailed to the cross.
Yeah. It would make sense that some of these false teachers would have been Jews, because a lot of Paul's teaching at this time would have been from the Old Testament prophecies, showing their fulfillment. And they would have had a knowledge of that and been able to have duplicated that, possibly.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And
right after Paul's first missionary journey, as we call it, there in Acts 13 and 14, then Acts 15, things have become already so prominent in the false teaching that's out there that the apostles need to come together with a lot of the brethren and to discuss and to sort this out and to find out what's right in Acts 15.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And earlier on in second, toward that, if you will, where he was he talked about Moses and the veil and all those types of things. He went back to some of those things to address those issues. I realize in the Corinthian letters, both First and Second Corinthians, Paul does not deal with the doing away of the law to the degree that he does in, say, Romans and even Ephesians. Is the more I read Ephesians, the more I see that that's one of the points that he's emphasizing there. And if he wrote Hebrews, obviously, but he deals with it. He does address it.
One of these kind of go back to this idea of what is the intention of these teachers, and I was thinking of Acts 15, and the Bible is saying that the Pharisee Christians were behind it, but it doesn't really judge their motives. You might even consider with Peter in Acts chapter 17, does he not become, in a sense, an apostle of Satan whenever he tells Jesus he won't allow Jesus to die, and Jesus tells him, get thee behind me, Satan? In that sense, Peter's motivation is probably impeccable in the sense that it's his desire and affection for Christ, but the problem is it's his desire and affection for Christ, not Christ's.
Yeah.
Well, something was off.
Yeah, and I believe that you meant you said Acts 17. I believe you meant Matthew 17.
I did. Sorry, you're right.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. As far as the difference between 13 and 14, much like Peter's description in 2 Peter chapter 2 regarding false teachers, Paul says, "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves." Shows intent to be something that they're not, to deceive the individuals. But yet, though, I kind of agree with Brian, though. I think there are times where you have individuals working for Satan not realizing they're working for Satan. For whatever reason, they're blinded to the truth, so they're going to plow ahead on what they think is right. And tell me what you think about this before we continue. The Bible talks about the Satan being the ruler of the world in effect. And I try to explain sometimes in my classes that I don't think he actually rules the world. I think he has the rule only in that people don't follow God, so they follow him. I mean, if everybody left the United States of America, who would President Obama be president over? And so Satan is only the ruler of the world in that people don't want to follow God, so they follow him. And therefore, anything that they do contrary to God, they're doing in the name of Satan without realizing that that's what they're doing. And maybe that's something else that he was dealing with at the same time. But anyway, sorry about that. Any thoughts?
I think you're completely wrong. No, I think it's a good point. I think about that. I express a similar thought to say that the concept of Satan's authority of the world is worldliness itself, which, like in 1 John 2, where he says, "Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life," is the vector that the world approaches us through, and that's where. And you go to Romans 6, where it says, if you whatever you serve is your master. That's how Satan rules the world, is because of that service. Just agreeing completely with what you said.
Okay, and I think this is what we're looking at here. Anyway,
John,
I think it's.
Let me again throw just another curve at it here, if I may. The best counterfeit money is that which, with every visual, looks the best, as though it is just real. The closest to reality and closest to actuality you can get, the better. but it just takes a little leaven to leaven the whole lump. That's
Right.
why Satan is so attractive. People don't dig deep down enough to find out exactly where sin is, and so these messengers of righteousness, these angels of light that appear to some people, are the devil in disguise, and it's deadly. That's why Paul was so insistent to the brethren at Thessalonica, who proved to be very studious people. Prove all things. Don't take the word for it. Go prove it.
Yeah.
Right.
Good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Eric, go ahead.
I was going to say that not every person who is teaching falsehood is motivated by greed or is actively trying to deceive people, but the scriptures are clear that some of them are.
Right.
And that's what Paul is saying here. We shouldn't be surprised if, in fact, because look at what Satan does, if that's what some of his servants do. I don't know that Jesus says you'll know them by their fruits, but I don't know that in all cases we can tell what someone's motivations are. But the counter to their, what makes someone a false teacher is ultimately that what they're teaching is false.
Right.
And the right way to counter that is with the truth. And we may or may not be able to tell, and it may not even be helpful in some cases to try to guess, if someone is what their motives might be or how sincere they are.
Yeah, let me clarify, Eric, because you're right. What I wanted to say out of all that is to say the motivation is irrelevant. That they may have the sincerest, as Paul did, the sincerest heart in doing what they do, but the motivation is irrelevant. And if we say, well, their motivation is good, we shouldn't hold them guilty, well, I think that they're just as likely to be a servant of Satan with a good motivation as with a bad one.
Right. Yeah. Now, of course, in time, some people's motives become evident. But you are absolutely true of that. And incidentally, to add to this discussion, like one thing that Mike said a moment ago, I cannot think of a false religion out there that does not have some element of truth to it. And in many instances, it even begins with a foundation of truth, or at least the similitudes to truth. You look at the religion of Jeroboam. In the Old Testament, where he erected golden calves to Dan and Bethel, and as I understand, I don't think that he was saying that those golden calves were somebody other than Jehovah God or Yahweh. He just changed the way to approach God, and he did a lot of things that were just like what God had said the children of Israel were to do. He created the places, he created the priesthood, and all those types of things. Most false religions have some truth, and some false religions have a lot of truth, but only a few areas in which they are false, but that does not change that they are false.
Wanted to add to that, Tom, as with Jeroboam, it's interesting, though, that while his so-called motives may have been right, throughout the Old Testament, after his sin, all the other wicked kings are compared to him, and it says who followed after Jeroboam, who caused Israel to sin. Wrong is wrong. And when individuals take it because it looks good, sounds good, tastes good, but haven't investigated it, I've used the illustration, you look at a box of Decon and everything in it is great cereal. It's just got a little bit of poison, so if you're hungry, go cook up a box of Decon, see what happens.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to do that because it's got just enough poison to be deadly.
Yeah, exactly. And for the sake of reference, if anybody's watching this and don't know what we're talking about, 1 Kings chapter 12 talks about Jeroboam establishing a false religion toward the end of that chapter. So.
Oh yeah. Paul, any thoughts or comments?
I had just in a private message. I know that there's been some controversy over who is a false teacher, and I mean it seems like it's a pretty straightforward that someone who teaches falsely is teaching things that are false. They are a false teacher, but there's some who draw a different designation about about that being given that title, I guess. But I was just kind of musing that over in my own mind. I don't know if we want to go there.
I know of a very specific preacher who, when he looks at 2 Peter chapter 2, and really, if you're going to look at 2 Peter chapter 2, you got to go back to chapter 1, the latter part of it, because it talks about the prophets of old, and just as there was false prophets of old, there are false teachers, and he, within his own conscience, if he sees someone teaching error, but he doesn't believe that they're doing it out of deception, he believes that they're sincere, he'll stand opposed to their error, but he won't call them a false teacher. In his mindset, the term false teacher is used by Peter very specifically, and he has to fill in individuals being deceptive. Someone is thriving on covetousness in order to have the following. Now, I don't have an issue with that because he opposes false teaching. I mean, if it's error, he'll stand against it without any problem whatsoever. But he's been raked over the coal by a few brethren because he wouldn't call this preacher a false teacher because this teacher taught false doctrine, but didn't do it in a deceptive and whatever way Peter describes it as. And I think sometimes people, I don't know, it was very sad to kind of see that. But to me, it's not a big deal. Someone teaches false, they're in error, and the teaching needs to be confronted. I mean, that's...
thinking about this, there's just a lot of things that come to mind, and I'm going to go ahead and throw them out there, and I don't have the solution to this, by the way. But, this is a discussion that's can take many different directions. Yeah. But in looking at the idea of a false teacher, I wonder how many areas or what specific teaching someone has to be wrong on to be a false teacher. Do you think that we all are in 100% agreement on every question? I would say there's not.
That's why I have you on my study. We are.
Yeah, there's not even a possibility that we're all on the same page on everything. We would have disagreements. Sometimes those have come out in our study. Well, then is that person who I believe I'm right and he's wrong? Is he false on that? Is he teaching falsely? I don't have all the answers to those. And on what issues does it have to be? Which are the major issues and which are the ones that we let slide? I don't know.
Exactly, and that is very much a debate. Determining what issues are grounds for, considering fellowship and so on, and it's not clear cut. But at the same time, when those arguments are being made, and I'm not accusing you of this, but when those arguments are being made, a lot of times it's in an effort to defend somebody that they know is teaching something contrary to what the Bible teaches, and the problem is, where do you draw that line? I'm hesitant to draw that too close to the center, or too far left, or whatever the word is for liberal. I'm hesitant to draw the line that way, but it is definitely a challenge, and I totally agree with you on that, Paul. I struggle with that.
Let me bring something in. Randy in the chat room says we are responsible for what we believe, practice, and teach. Yes. And that's a few minutes earlier when he had made that statement. And the truth of the matter is, right is right, wrong is wrong, truth is truth, false is false. Now, if I unintentionally teach something incorrectly from the text, am I wrong? Well, I'm wrong on what I'm teaching. Has it jeopardized a soul? Have I misrepresented the Son of God? What's the consequence of my teaching? I think maybe sometimes we have to ask that question. What's the consequence of it? Like, for instance, if I taught that it's wrong to take the Lord's Supper on Sunday night, and that's my conscious belief, well, I might be wrong with that as far as according to Scripture, but it doesn't impact anyone. There's not an impact upon the soul's salvation. But if I teach, in the case of marriage, divorce, remarriage, a doctrine that allows someone who cannot marry to marry, then I have endangered a soul, whether I'm sincere or not, whether, and I may believe it till the day that I die, but if I jeopardize a soul, I have to give an account to God for what I've taught. So I think it's kind of hard to say, well, because he teaches this, we're going to brand him a false teacher. It needs to be, look, here's the truth. Teach truth. If you don't, then we're going to counter that with what the truth actually is. And if I jeopardize my soul, then no matter what you believe about me, my soul's been jeopardized. And I don't know. I think. Do you think maybe that's the question? If I'm off on a point that the Bible teaches, and it ended, and the consequence is the jeopardizing of a soul, do you think maybe that's where the danger lies? Not so much in just being wrong on a point.
Well, maybe there's two steps to that, because the other half of that is, what do you do? Mike has said it in our private discussion. What do you do when you're proven wrong? And actually, Eric said it in our chat roll too, about the issue with Apollos. Apollos was teaching something that was critically wrong about baptism.
Right.
But when he was corrected, he changed right away. I think that there might be a case to say that somebody was corrected. Jude says in Jude verse 22 that there's a distinction to be made, and I think he's talking about the one who's in error. The distinction is whether they need to be, completely put away or brought into that truth. And I would suggest that it might well be that we're supposed to make a distinction as to whether a man is teaching. You make a good point to say, MDR is a great one, because there are people who you could talk to, you're blue in the face, and they just will not listen to what you have to say. There's a place where that distinction can be made.
Right.
Yeah. I actually preached a sermon, I believe it was earlier last year or maybe the year before, was Apollos a false teacher? And my premise is, yes, he was a false teacher. However, because of his honesty, when he learned the truth, he changed. And there's a big difference there with, like what Mike is bringing up, Michael, in our private chat. You've got those that it's not really about somebody changing. It's about me being able to recognize somebody that we know is teaching a doctrine that is harmful. Like John said, somebody that is in an unscriptural marriage is in an adulterous relationship, and we cannot fellowship that. And if congregations are going to tolerate that type of conduct, then that puts into question their faithfulness.
Well, is it not the case, fellas, that I know it is in my case, and I'll limit it there. Over the years, I've changed my view on a lot of things, and I've done it because of a great deal of study. Both individually and with a lot of gospel preachers, with brethren that were older and wiser, which that's all of them. If we're forbidden to learn, then we all have to become false teachers.
Right.
If we are too stubborn to change our mind, then maybe we ought to be labeled false teachers. But other than that, I believe what we need to understand is we're learning like everybody else.
Yeah, and
mistakes. Let's go to the book and see what the book says.
One of the challenges, John, to the definition of false teaching being something that could potentially cost someone their soul is that practically, not maybe every issue, but so many. I mean, you even take something like the head covering or the second serving or, self-protection or any of those kinds of things. To someone on one side of it who feels that this is what the Word of God teaches, they would almost have to conclude that if you disregard that or if you disobey it, that you would be in sin. And someone who sees the second serving as unauthorized sees it would have to be in the same category as instrumental music or something else that's not an authorized form of worship. And so the only subjects then that wouldn't potentially be a threat to your salvation would be something totally like how, did Adam and Eve have a belly button or some crazy, completely irrelevant to daily life kind of a debate that would truly be a foolish and unlearned question and not worthy of any kind of debate. But so many of the rest of these things, they do impact the way we live, and I don't have the answer, but it just complicates the question because almost always somebody is going to feel like it is a matter of right and wrong.
Right.
That's a very valid point.
Yeah, and another interesting observation as we demand book, chapter, and verse for what we believe, and I find it interesting that in churches of Christ, among some preachers, have we established an environment to where if somebody rethinks something, that they're afraid to rethink it and to say it because they're going to be branded or they're going to be marked as a result of that? I mean, I know that I tell people, search the truth. Study for yourself. You have to do that. Don't think that I'm going to be standing beside Jesus on the day of judgment, deciding who goes to heaven and who doesn't. But have we created an environment in some instances where if somebody takes a slightly different view on something, that we do not even give them the opportunity to prove that, or even consider what they say, or consider their arguments, and just immediately we brand them?
Well, a lot of it has to do with your association with those people as well.
Yeah.
I have known individuals who, and I'm going to use the term clique, that might not be the right idea, but preachers who have been friends for a long time who are more tolerant and long-suffering with one of their buddies who might differ with them, but you let someone outside the group differ with them.
Yeah.
Then it's a little bit different scenario. But let me throw this out real quick. And we know from Hebrews chapter 5, 12 to 14, that not all Christians will have the knowledge they should have. We understand that. Desire the sincere milk of the word, you may grow thereby, 2 Peter chapter 2. Okay. Romans chapter 14 clearly illustrates that there are going to be some matters that not everyone's going to have the same knowledge on. And none of that is condemned. What is condemned is when people refuse to grow. What is wrong is when we refuse to study. And I think Mike was kind of touching on this. A little side issue. It reminded me of the weaker brother from Romans chapter 14 and what we're talking about in 1 Corinthians. I used to think the weaker brother was the one that had lesser knowledge on the given subject. I've come to think that now the weaker brother is the one who is unwilling to stand up for his conscience. And so therefore, if you do something that he feels consciously is wrong and he feels beholden to do it, it is that which he is weak in, and not so much a reference to his lack of knowledge in that area. But ultimately, when you think about the area of growth that we all have to grow, we're not going to all agree, but we strive to be of the same mind, and hopefully with all studying with the same approach, we will eventually be, where we should be. Anyway, a lot of that has nothing to do with what we're looking at. But any final thoughts or comments before we kind of segue back into the text here?
Well, I think in a roundabout way, it has to do with what we're talking about, because we're dealing with deceitful workers, people transforming themselves. Not that their motives are corrupt, but...
Yeah, but, okay, the difference is that Paul's dealing with people who appear to be intentionally trying to take what he has and maybe undermine him. He's not talking about brethren who are just sincerely wrong in an understanding and are needing to grow.
Yeah, and questioning.
Exactly, yeah. One thing real quick, in the biblical account, has there ever been a time when Satan disguised himself as an angel of light?
I was wondering the same thing.
I should have asked this earlier.
Well, Mike kind of threw us something, and then we kind of went past it, but I think Mike was kind of pointing out, you wonder about some of these guys who have revelations from angels. I was thinking like Muhammad or Joseph Smith or something, whether or not, this is a metaphorical statement or
an actual literal statement, whether or not he's referring to people who would be truly seeing an angel of light that was actually the devil, or claiming to see an angel of light.
And that's why Muhammad was right.
And Peter says
that
there are doctrines of demons in 1 Peter 4.
Yeah.
And so that, it is interesting. And Paul says that some of the things that people offered to idols were actually offered to demons. And so I have often wondered about whether there could be behind some of these false religions a direct effort by Satan. Obviously, he's behind all lies, but what if he was actually, the source of some of the, lying wonders and those kinds of things?
Well, maybe angel's a messenger, and the messenger has a message, and sometimes it is that sinful practices can have a very appealing nature to them, can even appear as something good and right to the uninformed. And I don't know if the situation in the beginning of the book of Job might stir anybody's thoughts or not, but possibly.
Well, you think about what John says. 1 John 1, or 1 John chapter 4, try the spirits, test the spirits. I'll explain that as those who would claim to be teaching by the Spirit. That's what they say. If we are an angel from heaven, bring any other doctrine to you. I don't think in Galatians 1, Paul was warning them that an angel might bring something different, but I explained it as he was preparing them for those people who would make the claim that an angel told me. Mm-hmm. And maybe in this case here, it's a similar type thing that maybe some people would claim to be an angel of the light, when in reality they are working in conjunction with the desires of Satan. And what's interesting is when you study historically, and this I can't remember who the Greek architecture or Egyptian, maybe an Egyptian architecture. Anyway, they have found some writings in his. Anyway, this guy had developed a method to make the temple doors open by themselves when you burn something on an altar outside. And what it was water heating up, and the boiling water would come through and work the mechanism where doors were open. Now, whether or not that was ever implemented, I don't know, but they found his drawings, and I thought, you know what, they use trickery just like people do today to make people think that there was some sort of demonic or God behind it. So maybe that's simply what, when he talks doctrine of demons, that's what he's talking about, type thing there. Okay, any other thoughts or comments about this?
A lot of that I think will be, I wondered, it's like Moses in those Egyptian magicians, how do they do what they do? We may not know. The answer to all of it is that we have the truth, and all these instructions that Paul gives Timothy and Titus in facing all of these things are go teach the truth, and that's about all we can do, really, is just to teach the truth, and it is the antidote to sincere or deceivers or whatever it is, whether there's demons involved or not. The answer to all of it is that we have the truth, and that's what we have to latch onto.
And Eric, take that to about what Mike said, I think, earlier. Ultimately, our goal should be willing to be corrected if we're wrong.
Yes, right.
We don't study to improve our belief. We study to improve it. We study to be right with God, not right before man. Yeah. So verse 15 says, so it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, their end will correspond to their deeds. Again, do you think maybe he is intentionally referencing those people who are trying to undermine his work, not the sincerely wrong person?
Yeah.
I wonder with how strong he states it, their end will correspond to their deeds. I think he's talking about those who are intentionally trying to undermine his work.
I kind of wonder, though, if their ends will be according to their works, might not be what Jesus said in Matthew 7, that you'll know them by their fruits. We kind of look at this as a judgment statement that they're going to perish, but I also wonder if it's not perhaps a concept of the idea that it's their fruits that we're going to know them by.
Right.
Well, that was my turn to jump out.
That's why we can't trust John. So.
All right. Am I back yet? I see my picture.
Yeah,
you're back. You're back.
Oh, there I am. Okay.
Yeah, you're back.
I
want to add to what Eric said, because it really is important to say. Eric said it really doesn't matter so much so long as we speak the truth, but it's worth us to consider that. I was thinking of Deuteronomy, where the prophet in Deuteronomy 13, where it says that a prophet might come and what he says might even come to pass. Or in some way he might actually, you might say he might work some kind of miraculous work. But the point is, if he tells you to do something contrary to God's will, you don't follow it.
After idols, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, his message reveals him.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to figure out how to factor into this passage that we're dealing with here, John 7:44, where it talks about how Jesus describes them as you are of your father the devil. He was a liar from the beginning, and so on. And basically, Jesus is exposing them. Of course, he knows their motives are absolutely corrupt. And but my point is, even though they were obviously worldly and they had corrupt motives in a lot of different things, they still thought they were doing the right thing. They thought that they were right where God was concerned.
Who?
The Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees.
The ones that rejected the teachings of Christ?
Yeah. Well, look at Paul and what he did prior to his conversion.
Yeah, but Jesus calls those Pharisees hypocrites.
Yes.
They were different kinds, I think.
Yeah. And they also say, without a doubt, something notable has taken place.
Yeah.
And we cannot deny it.
Yeah, we cannot deny it, but yet let's command these men not to preach.
Yeah.
That goes back to Mike's comment about needing to be willing to be corrected.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I'm just wondering, when we look at the example of 2 Corinthians 11 that we're talking about, are these false teachers fitting into that category? To that degree.
I don't know if we could fully answer it, because we are working on an assumption based on some passages that there was an open attack against Paul, and therefore, based on that, that's who he's talking about here. And I don't think it's a wrong assumption. I think there's enough evidence there to support it. But I really think he's addressing those who were intentionally trying to undermine his work.
Right.
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 But I could be wrong, though, in that, obviously.
Right.
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? How about from you, Paul? Or go ahead, Eric. No,
I was thinking, you started the whole thing off by when in verse 12, he says, "What I'm doing, I will continue to do."
Yeah.
And if we look right to verse 11, that he's referring to loving them. But if we back up to the context right before that, he was talking about the fact that he did not accept support.
Right.
And I wonder if maybe he's just saying, and I will continue to do things the way I did, because if these guys are false and deceitful, then they're not going to be willing to follow his example of basically, doing it at their own expense and all that. If they're really looking, as Peter and Jude warned, if they're motivated by greed and things like that, that's going to help to highlight who's true and who is not.
Right. Yeah. Going back to the scribes and Pharisees, one of the interesting observations about them during the final week, they were so determined to entrap Jesus that they asked him questions that they thought they could get him either way. I almost see that in some of the motives. In other words, no matter what Paul would have done, they would have found something to accuse him of.
Okay. All righty. Have we picked this enough apart? 12 through 15.
I would say certainly.
Yeah. We have some chat in the discussion, and I know we're not going to specifically mention this or go over it, but there's a little bit of interesting discussion going on that has mentioned at least 4 different predominant false teachers.
Yeah.
and it's it's a discussion that has talked a little bit about motives.
Yeah.
Where they are concerned, and but they're all false teachers.
Yeah, and you're right. I'm not going to name them by name over the air. There's over live discussion. There's no point in it. But a couple times that I believe, from all external appearances, appears to be very sincere.
Yes.
But in the end, his doctrinal position is wrong. And I've known individuals who I believe doctrinally are wrong when it comes to what's necessary for salvation, but yet they read their Bible every day, they study every day, and I can't figure out why can't they see the truth. But they can't. So, All right. Well, let me ask you this. I have now that it is. Sorry, Paul. I've got about 5 minutes till. Do we want to go ahead and start with verse 16, or do you think it may be better to go ahead and pull the discussion to a close today so we can hit the following section a little bit without having to break it up like we would have to do?
Right. Well, you know, we have held them over before, so we could give them a break today, balance it.
Randy in the chat room says we are to teach the truth, live and practice it. It is is the way of life that we're supposed to live, and so that's a good closing thought there.
Yeah.
It really is a challenge. I mean, as a gospel preacher, and depending on what clique of preachers you are kind of embraced and follow, if you would. It's a challenge when you disagree with people and people disagree with you. You know, I mean, depending on what group you walk with, you can't have preacher X to hold a gospel meeting, but you can have preacher Y to hold a gospel meeting. You know, and it's and if we're going to listen, and we talk about the autonomy of the church, but I think sometimes if we're not careful as preachers, we end up dictating what churches can and cannot do, just by sheer sake of saying, well, we're not going to announce your meeting, so if you have that person, we're not going to come down and support it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then we become fearful of what others may do to us, and so then we back off.
Comes back to the question, John, who's running the asylum? You know, if Christ is honored, then we're going to accept the fact that none of the rest of us, as good as we may be, are the greatest preacher that ever walked. Christ is.
Yeah.
We just need to accept that. And the fact that we even mentioned that there are cliques doesn't speak well about speak the same thing, be of the same mind one toward another, be of the same judgment. There's obviously a problem here, and being the old guy again, I'm going to pull that card with you. I see that nothing more as ego. Mm-hmm. If we just simply come back to say, here's what the scriptures say, here's my understanding of it, reason with me, then a lot of this egotistical, I'm greater than you are and I've studied more than you have, yada, 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 goes away, and we just get back to the book.
So we should have a stating, instead of let go of my ego, it should be let go of your ego.
Absolutely.
Or my ego, you know. There was a preacher a couple years ago who wrote an article on Romans chapter 16, verse 17, where it says, "Mark those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine of Christ." And he took the Greek word there, mark, and he pulled from an external non-biblical lexicon, I guess, or dictionary, how that word could be used in secular writings of the day. And he says it's the idea of getting up on a hill, and you're up on a hill looking out for an enemy. And the whole point is that it wasn't applying only to the local church to identify problems within the local church, but to be up on a hill for the whole of the brotherhood. And if you spot someone in Timbuktu who could be teaching error, then you who live 3,000 miles from Timbuktu, you stand up for the congregation and warn them about the impending threat of that teacher. You know, all based on the definition of the word mark there. And that leads to the very thing you're talking about, Mike. Mm-hmm. I mean, error is error, and if someone's teaching false, then you need to teach the truth. And I think if they're locally, if they're around where you're preaching at, by all means, warn the congregation, especially if you see them to be somewhat charismatic, maybe drawing members to, you got to stand up. But the idea of warning people really seems to be within that local concept there.
Yeah.
But they would disagree with that and would disagree with this, and so.
John, there's a balance here in identifying those false teachers that it's really a hard thing. Maybe you've had the experience to talk with some preachers that you know, and sometimes I talk with a preacher and he has good things to say about some of the other preaching brethren, but I've had the opportunity to talk with some, and no matter what name you bring up of someone you know or whoever it is, and it doesn't matter, there is something that they have wrangled with them about, and some way in which we are brethren, and at some point in time, I don't. What I said before is still true. I don't know where that balancing line is.
That's the problem.
But we can't have every other person, because they're not in 100% agreement with us, to be our enemy. It's hard.
Don't you get the monthly list of vetted preachers that are sent out to all churches?
You're not on that email? Is that what you're saying?
See, that's why I like all you guys. We're all a bunch of no-names, so it's not a big problem,
I know a brother that would not participate in a group like this because he couldn't agree with everybody, and therefore he just sort of stays away from everybody. He kind of isolates himself.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
and I would say that's probably, if your conscience is like that, that's probably and I don't think there would necessarily be wrong to be like that. It might be a little lonely, but
especially if you're very combative.
Yeah.
So it might be that, in other words, I'll use myself. If I become a part of that study, if I engage in that, then I might be associated with Paul Adams, and we all know what he stands for, and so we can't do that.
And therefore you're as unsound as Paul.
And there are, to be honest, there are probably groups that I would not engage in this kind of Bible study with, maybe for that very reason. But it would be something more extreme than all the things that you guys are wrong about and haven't learned that I'm right yet.
Well, what I don't like is when someone says, "Have you lost your mind? Are you kidding me? You really see that's what Paul is saying there? Haven't you studied the scriptures?" That's the attitude there.
John, you say that one really frustrates me. An attitude that kind of suggests, well, if you had actually read it, Brian, you would see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I tell you what, let's bring in one more one more comment from the chat room before we close. What did you say, Paul?
When I said that, that you all should see things like I do. I was just
sure you were.
Really?
We know deep down what you really meant.
Yeah, right.
Let's bring in Jeremy's comment. I'm sorry. I think I've got it up on the screen there. Jeremy B. Kinney, if you'd like to, Paul.
Sure. Jeremy says, when trying to teach individuals regarding misinterpretation and false teaching, when not done maliciously, does there come a point in time when your efforts at teaching will be better used elsewhere? Just a thought. Jeremy, that's a great question. And in looking at that, I have approached that. When do you stop? I've gotten sometimes involved in a Bible discussion that it just seems to be going nowhere. And when do you say, okay, there's other folks who I need to be teaching, and I need to let that go? Let me go back to the chat there. It says, Brian answers. I didn't realize Brian answered. Sorry. Perhaps that is what Jesus meant in Matthew 7:6. Do not give what is holy to dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Maybe there's a reality there, and I think this is what maybe Brian's referring to in looking at that at some point in time you have to say, when they reject the truth, something right in front of them, didn't you read that? Maybe that's a time in which you say, well, we're not operating on the same standard. We're not using the same measurement, the same ruler, and so we're going to have to go in a different direction.
Use our efforts towards someone else. Tell me if you think this is off base. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 said he watered and Apollos, he planted and Apollos watered. God gave the increase. Do you think maybe what Jeremy's talking about is sometimes where we might be overwatering? If an individual just refuses to accept the truth, all we're doing is just saturating him with the word, and we could go water another area for a while and then come back to it.
Yeah, I had a man tell me, John, just simply put that he knew what the right thing to do was, and he wasn't going to do it, and so I didn't say anything else to him.
Well, that's where you bring in Hebrews 6:4-6, depending on who you're talking about. There is the individual. Yeah.
There's somebody who needed to obey the gospel, but yeah, the same principle would apply with those who've departed from the truth as well.
Well, let's plan then to pick up with our study next week in verse 16 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and talk about Paul's purpose for boasting. We kind of get a better idea as to why he's saying what he's saying. Any other final thoughts or comments? Let's start with you, Brian.
A lot of nuggets of wisdom you guys brought out here. I appreciate it. Nothing else to add.
All right. I appreciate what you contributed to the study, Brian, for sure. Eric?
I think we all hopefully appreciate the importance of the truth and the danger of becoming one of those false teachers by simply not, clinging to and having the courage to say what the Scriptures say, regardless of what other people will think about it.
And Eric, not letting our life situation alter the truth for us.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. So, yeah, that's right. Mike, any final thoughts?
I appreciate this study more than you guys will ever know. To dig down deep into these things and find out what we do consider as false teacher is a subject that we've done it for an hour and we've just touched the hem of the garment.
Yeah, right.
But I really appreciate the fact that you guys are on the same page as guys like me that are willing to say, hey, I don't understand this, help me, or you misunderstand it, let me help you. I appreciate the fact that at least with us, we're willing to sit down and say, help me learn more.
Right.
That needs to be the attitude of everybody.
That's right. That's right. Tom?
Again, yeah, I appreciate everything that we've engaged in today. Another great discussion like last week. Things that we as preachers need to take seriously.
That's right. And Paul?
If I've said anything wrong, and I'm sure the other guys feel the same way, hope that you feel that you can approach us, and you can send us an email with our first name, and for those who may have long first names, it's the shorter version, like not Thomas, but Tom, not Michael, but Mike, or Paul, or Eric, or John, or Brian, at truthfactor.com. And you can express that to us, or questions at truthfactor.com. We'll get all of us, and we'd be happy to hear what you have to say. And right. Because we don't want to be wrong, we don't want to be false, don't want anyone to be influenced by anything that we would say that was not according to Scripture.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it's not about being right with us, it's being right with God and teaching His Word, and that's what our goal is, to factor it into our daily lives. If you ever want to write Wayne, you can send it to Wayne. Don't use the short version, Way, because we don't use that here, but it's Wayne at truthfactor.com. All right. Eric looks puzzled at that one. Sorry. Thank you so much for joining us. And Lord willing, we'll see you back here again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That'll be at noon in the Eastern Time Zone.
And 9 o'clock Pacific Time.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.